Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoominar. It is January 9th, 2024, and it's 4 p.m. in California, which makes it early in the morning of January 10th in Tokyo. Ohayo gozaimasu. Hello from both places. I have with me today Robert Feldman and Kenji Kushida, who I will introduce shortly. Before I do so, let me just wish you akemashite omedetou gozaimasu. May the year of the dragon be come much better than it has started for Japan, much, much, much better. This is the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor here and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, jfit. This finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. And here there's some numbers about us. Importantly, we offer 8 degrees, one of which is a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If that's at all of interest to you or anybody you know, please look us up at gps.ucsd.edu. And jfit is our Japan Center. You can learn more about us at jfit.ucsd.edu. Our events are recorded, and there are 2 implications of that. One, as we go through our hour here, feel free to type any questions into the Q&A box. If I read out your question, I will refer to you only by your first name to make sure that your privacy is protected. On the good news side, all of this means that we have a JZ gallery where you can find links to past events. So including this one, you can watch again in the future. If you go to our website under JZ Gallery, you'll find the recordings. So today we're going to talk about entrepreneurs in Japan, but I would be amiss if I didn't tell you that our next one is also about entrepreneurship. We'll have Rick Katz, who just finished a book on entrepreneurship in Japan titled The Contest for Japan's Economic Future. And Rick and I will talk about this book. There's much more to come. Please stay tuned. All right, so today's event is about entrepreneurship in Japan, and I want to make 2 announcements. One, it is sponsored by the government of Japan in the context of this book, and the book is titled History of Innovative Entrepreneurs in Japan. This is from a series of Springer books that are so-called open access, which is a newfangled word for free. You can download these books from this website. So if you Google Springer Books, Innovative Entrepreneurs in Japan, it'll pop up and you can read it there. It turns out that there's a whole series of these books, including one on Japan's political reforms that was translated by Tobias Harris, who was on our show previously, and a large number of other very interesting books. So I can very much recommend looking this up. All right, and with that, let me stop my share and introduce our speakers today. So we're going to talk about Professor Kikkawa's book, and he unfortunately cannot join us today, but he has kindly made a short video that I will play. But before I do play this video, let me introduce our speakers. So we have Robbie Feldman with us. Robbie is, of course, a known quantity to most people in the audience. He's a senior advisor at Morgan Stanley MUFG Securities, where he has worked since 1998. And before that, I don't know exactly the transition, Robbie, but before that, he was at Salomon Brothers. And before that, he was a researcher at the Bank of Japan, where he was my senpai, because I actually did that after you, Robbie. He's been the professor of the Tokyo University of Science, Management of Technology program from 2017 to 2022. And for 20 years, I don't know how you did that, Robbie, from 2000 to 2020, he was a commentator on Japan's nightly business program, World Business Satellite. Robbie holds a PhD in economics from MIT and a BA in economics and Japan studies from Yale. He's written 9 books in Japanese, 2 in English. He has translated 3. I don't know, Robbie, where your energy is from. It's amazing. And the second speaker is Kenji Kushida. Kenji is a senior fellow at the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he runs a program called Innovative Japan, Global Japan. He's also a senior advisor at Macro Advisory Partners at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies. Prior to doing all that, he spent, I don't know, maybe a decade or so at Stanford's APARC Center and ran a big program on bringing Japanese entrepreneurs to Japan. His PhD is from Berkeley in political science, and it was actually on entrepreneurship. I seem to recall, Kenji, it was about Keitai or something. Kenji also holds an MA in East Asian Studies and a BA in Economics and East Asian Studies from Stanford. All right, so before we start, let me share Professor Kikkawa's short video. This is a 3-minute video, and I hope that the technology gods will allow me to do this. He will introduce his book that we will then use as a launch pad for our discussion of Japanese entrepreneurship in Japan today. So here is Professor Kikkawa.
My name is Takeo Kikkawa, PhD in economics. I am currently the president of the International University of Japan and Professor Emeritus of the University of Tokyo and Hitotsubashi University. Today, I will give an overview of my book, History of Innovative Entrepreneurs in Japan, published by Springer in 2023. The book introduces more than 20 of Japan's leading innovative entrepreneurs from the 17th century to the present. It outlines the innovative business models carried by entrepreneurs, including Takatoshi Mitsui of Mitsui Zaibatsu, H. Shibusawa of Daiichi Bank, Toyoda Kiichiro of Toyota, Panasonic's Konosuke Matsushita, Honda's Soichiro Honda, Sony's Akio Morita, First Retailing, Uniqlo's Tadashi Yanai, and SoftBank's Masayoshi Son. While introducing innovators, the book also raises 3 broader questions as follows. First, why did Japan industrialize earlier than any other country outside Europe and the United States of America? Second, why was Japan able to realize unsurpassed economic growth between the 1910s and the 1980s? The third, why has Japan's economy stagnated for more than 30 years since 1990s? Drawing upon analytical concepts, including Schumpeter's breakthrough innovation, Gardner's incremental innovation, and Christensen's disruptive innovation. It condenses that Japan's successes were based on unique and systematic breakthrough innovation and accumulation of incremental innovation, while it later fell victim to a combination of breakthrough innovation from advanced countries and disruptive innovation by developing countries. These are outline of my book. I hope this book will reach as many readers as possible.
Okay, great. So it's too bad that Kikkawa Sensei cannot be with us today, but it's great to have this introduction. And for those of you who joined after my introduction, so this is the book that Kikkawa Sensei was talking about, which is an open access book that you can download online. So Kenji Kushida, who is, of course, a political scientist and not a translator, actually I don't know what the right verb is actually, helped, let's just say helped, with the translation of this book into English. So Kenji, I want to start with you, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what's in the book, why people should, download it, and your main takeaways, and we'll start with that.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I've always wanted to be on your show, so I'm happy to be here. So this book, I think, well, let me back up and start with a little story. When I was little growing up in Tokyo, I went to an international school. I could speak both English and Japanese. Some of my relatives said, hey, you can be a translator. And my father stepped in and said, you know, you might as well write things that are going to be translated by others rather than doing the translators. So I never do translations. However, this book I found was important enough that the government's efforts to make it free and open to the general public in English was worth helping out. And so the actual translators, professionals, did the real translation, but I had the pleasure of looking over it and looking at some of the details. And I think it's well worth, there are many things that one can pull out of this. And so what this basically is it's 16 cases of 22 entrepreneurs interspersed with Professor Kikkawa's essays on the historical context of various types and forms of innovations. I'm going to run through a couple of the major figures and some of the context, which I think as Ulrike said in your opening remarks, is a great launch pad for a discussion into entrepreneurship, startups, et cetera, in contemporary Japan, and which opens into the Japanese economy. Right. So the first entrepreneurs are in the Edo period, 1603 to 1869. That's the period where historians have looked at. There are antecedents of modern industrialized Japan in there. Right. And so the emergence of some of the entrepreneurial families who pioneered new business models in a relatively, well, quite closed environment, right? Japan was closed off from the rest of the world. So there was trade within different fiefdoms and across different fiefdoms. And the emergence of families like the Konoike family, they diversified business from sake production and sales to shipping and then financial services. The Sumitomo family, right? They managed copper mines that were directly controlled by the Edo shogunate, and then they expanded from there. The Mitsui family, sound familiar, these names, right? They transformed retail and expanded into the financial industry. And so the main Zaibatsu families, the family-owned holding companies that were very diversified conglomerates that dominated a lot of Japan's economy right up to the pre-war period, and then the antecedents afterward, a lot of the origins can be found by a close examination of some of these early families and what they introduced. Management practices and what the like. And then Meiji period from 1868 to 1912. This is the period of modernization and industrialization. And it started from about 15 years before the Restoration, when, of course, U.S.-Japan relations opened with a bang when Commodore Perry arrived in 1853, forced open Japan later with a bunch of treaties in 1858. The key concepts here were accumulation of labor and capital. How did Japan do that? Mostly from domestic sources without going into deep debt abroad. And so this is a focus on some of the entrepreneurs that were pioneering various ways of management and sort of managing their relationship with the government so that they didn't become fully co-opted by the government, but they nonetheless used the government investment as a boomerang, as a launch pad to do various kinds of heavy capital investments. So things like companies that we're familiar with, like Tokyo Marine Insurance, 1879, Nippon Railway, 1881. These were founded around the rise of Zaibatsu industrial groups. So people like were also professional managers hired into these family-owned conglomerates, like Nakamigawa Hikojiro, who was a director of Mitsui Bank, but he reformed the Zaibatsu to move beyond state support, led industrialization, deployed high levels of salaried managers rather than keeping it as a family organization. The Mitsubishi Zaibatsu was founded by Iwasaki Yataro and then Yanosuke. They were founded on shipping, but then they diversified into shipbuilding. Then they broke away from government business. Others like Yasuda Zenjiro and Asano Soichiro started coal and cement, and then they combined financial Zaibatsu with sort of industrial Zaibatsu, Yasuda Bank and Fukagawa Cement, which then became one of the major industrial families. And then Shibusawa Eiichi, who is about to be featured on the new 10,000 yen bill as Japan's biggest serial entrepreneur, historical figure that we know about, who founded over 500 companies or were involved in. He supported about 600 education institutes. He kept securing funding by selling shares of his current company, then using funds to establish the next company. So a lot of industrial Japan owes their origins to Shibusawa Eiichi, First National Bank, Daiichi Kangyo Bank, Nippon Yusen, NYK, Japan's biggest shipping company, Tokyo Gas, Tokyo Electric Light, Teikoku Hotel. Some of you have stayed there. Sapporo Beer. Some of you have drank. All right, anyway, Ishikawajima Shipyard, Tokyo Savings Bank, et cetera, Industrial Bank of Japan, Imperial Theater Company. He was also a social entrepreneur, starting a bunch of educational institutions, a foster home, Association of Prevention for Tuberculosis, and important in today's climate, given what happened on New Year's Day, the Post-Great Kanto Earthquake Benevolent Association, which was to help out people who are displaced. He was one of Japan's most advanced capitalists in the sense of favoring open economic systems rather than closed zaibatsu family-owned systems. He wanted limited role of government, and he was oriented towards private sector management, where Japan could have gone one of multiple pathways, and he helped shape it towards a capitalist side. But at the same time, it was a little different from the sheerest form of capitalism, because he was always asked that stakeholders make long-term commitments. He discouraged self-serving behavior, and he actually also called for a certain level of order in corporate competition. Competition was great, but not anything goes. So, and there are a few others in the pre-war era that are worth, even if you, the Japanese term is just read diagonally through the book, but some innovators like Suzuki Saburosuke, who commercialized Ajinomoto, which is MSG of umami. This was breakthrough innovation. And then some of the big entrepreneurs like Toyoda Kiichiro, who was the effective founder of Tokyo Motor Corporation, that was established on the basis of getting support from Toyota Automatic Loom Works. So we start to see this pattern of existing companies helping out a new area develop, and then the new area becomes far more important than others. And in the 1920s up through then, it was dominated by the four zaibatsu, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Yasuda. But a new set emerged in the 1930s. These were holding companies and groups that included Nissan. It goes through the founder of that, Mr. Aikawa, others like Idemitsu Sazo, which is the oil refinery. He was an oil merchant who went to sort of the Japanese empire on the continent. He was decimated, his business was. He came back and then pledged that he would do no layoffs right after the war, then created his own oil refineries without bringing in a lot of foreign capital. Others like Nishiyama Yataro, president of Kawasaki Steel, who then challenged the status quo where there were a small number of oligopolistic companies in the steel, and he brought in a new set of technologies and broke that apart and reorganized the steel industry, which was immensely important in Japan's early post-war years. And then we get to the 1950s onward, and especially the 1960s, where the Japanese economy transformed dramatically. There was an emergence of consumers who had extra income that they wanted to spend on household electronic goods. And so the rise of people like Matsushita Konosuke of Panasonic, where consumption started to drive GDP rather than just investment from industry or government expenditures, and others such as Saji Keizo of Suntory, Ishibashi Shojiro of Bridgestone Tire, Mitarai Takeshi of Canon, founder of and then Iue Toshio of Sanyo Electric. So there were among these group of post-war companies, the standout firms became global major companies, including Sony's Morita Akio and Ibuka, Mr. Ibuka, and Honda Soichiro of Honda. And so the book goes through a little bit about how these companies were newcomers. They went global very early. They solved a couple difficult technological problems that existing incumbent companies domestically didn't. Then they took those as a springboard to global markets. And they also entered large established markets that were initially peripheral businesses. Honda started with motorcycles, went into automobiles. Sony started with basically radios, and then went into televisions. And so the timing of people having disposable wealth, the wealthy, they grew up along with Japan's high growth era. And so
can I interrupt you there so we can go into the present tense later? Can you hold that thought there? Because I think this is actually a really great point to bring Robbie in. As we listen to these names, Robbie, and a lot of this, of course, sounds familiar, right? We know Toyota, we know Sanyo, we know Sony. But so Robbie, can you help us think a little bit about more in a sort of a structured way about what actually is an entrepreneur, right? And what patterns did you see there as you were kind of leafing through these wonderful stories?
And thanks very much. Yeah, I learned a boatload from this book. It was really very, very helpful. And one of the things that really struck me, as Kenji has just pointed out, is the continuity of the problems that the entrepreneurs faced from the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries on right to the present day. And what this says to me is that these entrepreneurs really did two things. They tied resources or tied markets together in different ways. The Japanese word I use is tabaneru, sort of bind things together. And so we see different entrepreneurs doing this in different ways. Honda tied different markets together with a new technology. The 15th century or 16th century people tied markets together using new technologies for transportation. So tying resources, tying markets together in new ways is part of the entrepreneurial activity. The other thing that all of them did, some of them more than others, was augment the resources that they had. I think Kushida-san's, Kenji's thing about the social entrepreneurship of Shibusawa is particularly important. But many of these guys actually endowed educational institutions so that they could have more people who could do the jobs they need. So this one is, I guess you could use the Japanese word soeru, or maybe fuyasu, as the element of the resources that they use or augmented. So when I see these things happening, I see these guys doing all kinds of things to tie resources together in new ways, augment them in new ways through better education, in particular by sending some of their people abroad. There was a very strong common theme from really the Meiji period onward, a little harder during the Edo period, but to get people to see the world. And so some of the entrepreneurs would send some of their best personnel abroad for a couple months or sometimes a couple of years to bring in new ideas. And this is where I think our current situation where trading information, accessing information globally is much cheaper than it was before. We take this for granted, but back then it wasn't. So these people had an amazing amount of insight saying, look, we don't know what's going on out there. We better find out and bring those ideas back to us. I was very impressed about all of them faced the issue of reallocating capital in different areas. There were a number of people who ran into trouble with political connections. The Mitsubishi Group early on, they had a great deal when they started, but when the government changed, they were on the outs, and so they really had a problem. And then Idemitsu, I thought, was the most interesting case in the whole thing to me, because the way he had to sort of roll with the punches of the 20th century. The other thing I thought was so interesting is in the early on, and this was a huge innovation, which is how to keep the family money together in one pot without breaking it up among all the potential heirs. And that was an innovation that I think kept some of these concerns going for a long time. The other thing all of them had to deal with, and some very successfully, others less so, was succession. Who takes over? Bringing in hired managers was a very, very good way to figure out what to do if your own kids don't want to take over the business. So I think this is a wonderful example of watching how different entrepreneurs over several centuries managed to tie resources together, augment them, and move into the next business in a very continuous way. So that's how I put things together.
So that's fantastic, right? And I guess we all kind of had heard these stories about the history of entrepreneurship, and then we go. So Kenji, sorry, I stopped you there in the middle of a sprint, but then we get more into the present tense, and suddenly these stories get much scarcer. So if I were to challenge you, even certainly before reading the book, but even after having read the book, if I were to challenge you and say, you have like 10 seconds. Give me 10 companies that were founded in Japan between 1965 and 1975. we can all think about Fanuc, Oryx, right? But then we start stuttering, right? There were of course some, but not nearly as many. So Kenji, what does Kikkawa Sensei do about sort of getting us into the present tense? So if you could resume your thread there, and let's see whether the story changes over what Robbie just mentioned.
Yeah, well, part of the, so as he runs through the various entrepreneurs, then he has a little discussion about what happened in Japan since the 90s. And following Robbie's theme here, one of his hypotheses is that the amount of investment allocated to different places, this just became structurally difficult for potential entrepreneurs to access. And so the cases that he does have, for example, Yanai Tadashi of Uniqlo, right, started from a single store, took over from the father. Core competence was a production system in China. Son Masayoshi with roots in Berkeley, a series of spectacular deals, which both of them, by the way, Robbie's comments, I mean, it's perfect, right? They've had difficulty with succession. They both brought in, it's not part of the book, but right, they've all brought in potential successors and then jettisoned them. And so, but the point, to bring it back to part of the structural issue, capital allocation, where do you get that? And that's bound up with all the other issues that get to the question of where you're going, Rike, of why weren't there more entrepreneurs that making companies that everybody around the world has heard of? So as I think a lot of the readership of this book can use this book for, I hope that we can launch into a discussion of exactly those points.
Yeah, so let's go there, right? So let me just throw my hypothesis out there and then see what you think. So we all heard about industrial policy, right? And so the idea, as I see it, in the 60s was that MITI and friends in the various industries decided that for Japan to grow fast, the government would support large companies. And there were also a number of laws that would protect these companies from foreign investment. And the government really put the whole system on steroids by channeling a lot of the funding through the banks, and that would go to these large companies. And it worked. It worked in many ways. Certainly the large companies got larger, so employment grew, the country grew, it was great. The foreign companies could not easily come in, so that worked too. And I think as maybe a collateral damage of that, though, not only could foreign companies not come in to compete, but domestic small companies also had a very hard time to get into that mix. There was also very little intellectual property right protection. So if I were a young engineer with a great idea and I had a really, really good idea, it probably would have been very difficult to protect that from just being taken on by one of these large companies that would then be celebrated for their innovation. So I think what happened in the 60s and 70s is not so much that somehow the Japanese lost their entrepreneurial spirit, but rather that the system was stacked against small farms. What do you think of this hypothesis? Mm-hmm. And if you want to refine it, maybe Robbie, you can maybe build a model around that.
I'm very sympathetic to that view, and I would add to it that the subsidies and protection so-called protection did not restrict themselves to large companies, because as the 60s and 70s went forward, we had more protection for smaller and smaller businesses. The large retail store law, for example, protected mom and pop shops that probably shouldn't have been there for in terms of efficiency of the retail system. So I think what you saw was a political system that gave more and more so-called protection to more and more actors. And what that ended up doing was allowing interest groups to hijack policymaking and protect themselves through rules. The result of that, of course, is that entrepreneurs couldn't come in. The incentives and the payoffs for the entrepreneurs who wanted to do something new weren't really all that easy to take advantage of. There were different exceptions. Ito-Yokado, for example, the supermarket chains that grew and are talked about in the book. But it was very, very difficult to implement things that would step on, call it vested interests. So my view is that it wasn't, I actually disagree with Professor Kikkawa on why this happened. He has this distinction between breakthrough, incremental, and disruptive innovations. To me, these are adjectives, and I want numbers. So I prefer to think of these issues of the 70s, 80s, and even 90s as issues of, call it monopoly, that should be analyzed through, say, the Hirschman-Herfindahl index and stuff like that, just measures of monopoly and measures of political power over how rules are determined. So if the people who make the rules that help the people who make the rules, you need somebody else to come in and say, no, we need to make the rules in a different way. And that's what I think was somewhat lacking in the 80s and the 90s and even in the 2000s as well.
And we have the first comment from the audience coming in. Jim reminds us, which is of course absolutely true, that the system of lifetime employment and the status of the salaryman, basically the high status of the salaryman, meant that that talent would go to the largest companies. And over time, out of that grew some sort of societal definition of success. For a young men, mostly, was to be a salaried employee at a very large company. The larger, the better. Right? So, Kenji, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd have about at least 3 different cuts into this. One would be that decentralized optimization of market solutions of specific problems ended up being very successful, that then became impediments for the next phase, right? So why did lifetime employment or relatively stable employment, why were those adopted by companies? The pre-war period didn't have that. Well, why would people want that? Well, if you have a population pyramid that you have a lot of very young people and you have a very high labor mobility, as a manager, it makes sense if you guarantee them longer term employment and wages go up, but you don't have to pay them immediately because they're mostly young. Then you've taken care of your problem of people that keep leaving, and you can invest in your employees. You can deploy them, say, oh, we're making a new shipbuilding yard over there. Please go there for a few years starting tomorrow. And so this was very, very helpful to a lot of the big Japanese companies doing these kinds of things. But then, and their families coming out of the chaos of post-World War II, not enough food, all of this stability sounded great. And so once you get a generation through there, then lifetime employment, well, actually it was only the male breadwinner optimization, because then if you have dual optimization and you say, oh, actually, we want you to go to Hong Kong for 3 years and then you're going to go to Hokkaido for 3 years tomorrow, then what do you do about the family? It just wasn't optimized for that. So of course, then it would take a long time to change these things once they're embedded in legal structures, judicial precedent. And the way that I view it is, if we look at things like main bank system lending, financial groups with main banks, relatively long-term employment, university government industry ties that were very much hands off, except for sending new graduates there, partly because of the trauma of World War II, where universities and researchers were co-opted. Large firms in organizations where they would use suppliers that were the small medium companies that were politically protected as the LDP's support base, as Robbie pointed out, that's the politics part, but they were suppliers, not counterparts. Well, all of these things served Japan really, really well, right, for the high growth era. And it turns out that they were very difficult to change because they were complementary to each other. And so if you're trying to toggle just one piece of it, yes, that would be quite different. And so that would lead to a discussion maybe a little later along the line of sort of modern startup ecosystems. How did the US go from long-term employment, stable, large company, 1950s style, to where we are now with startup ecosystems and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. So Alberto actually invites us to think about that. The question is about what creates entrepreneurial opportunity. And my immediate answer would have been a recession. It's just like a recession is often good for things like organized crime. But, so recessions are good for certain things, including, for instance, in Japan, that the ice age of not hiring in the 90s should have actually created a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. But Alberto was wondering whether the slowdown in entrepreneurial activity in Japan was driven more by policy than by a lack of opportunity. But I would think the 1960s and 1970s, the high growth period, would also have been a great time for any entrepreneur. Fast growth usually creates opportunity. Robbie, do you have any insights on this phasing and what markets do to entrepreneurs?
Well, I very much like your point about how recessions actually mix the pot and get resources to move. That's important. But when you're dealing, as Kenji said, with the lifetime employment system, it's harder and harder to get resources to move around. And here's a point where I think when I was teaching with Professor Kikkawa at the Tokyo University of Science, he was my colleague there for a number of years. One of the things that occurred to me while I was teaching there was that technology change and technology diffusion is heavily dependent on a flexible labor market where people can move around a lot. Now, in the high growth period, there was enough growth and people could move their personnel to different new subsidiaries and get things going well. But when the growth rate slows down and you've got a bunch of people who have got to stay in your firm or have a legal right to stay in, it's harder and harder to find places for them, but they don't want to quit because they would have a huge loss by going into the unorganized labor market. And so what I think happened partly was that the lifetime employment system slowed the rate of technology diffusion because you could not get the right people in the right jobs. And so when I was teaching at Tokyo University of Science, one of the best things I ever heard, and I keep hearing from my students, was when they said, I'm 43 or whatever, and I'm not going anywhere in this company and I'm not getting what I need. I'm going to quit and go somewhere else. And so I had one student who quit a large engineering company and went to a wind power company. All this is happening now, which is very different from what we saw in the 90s and 2000s. So I would point out the key role of labor mobility in accelerating technology diffusion.
I want to go to Kenji's question soon about Silicon Valley, but before I do, well, actually, before I do, let me ask a question about the 90s. So the 1990s in Japan were not a good time. Younger folks in the audience may not remember, but the bubble burst, there was a sort of denial, and then came some anger, and then the 7 phases of coping with the fact that Japan was basically that the things was over. The large companies stopped hiring. That should have been a time of great entrepreneurial activity, and yet it's not clear to me that other than Masayoshi Son, who of course came home from Berkeley at that time and saw the whole internet and so forth coming. So why wasn't there more in the 1990s? Do we know the answer to that, or is that something that somebody should write a PhD thesis about?
So if I can jump in, I didn't write a PhD thesis about it, but I have a series out of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace called Startup Japan that does dig at some of these. And I think implicit in the framing of this is why wasn't there more entrepreneurship? And implicit in that was why didn't it look a little bit more like the more successful startup ecosystems like Silicon Valley and other places where you had different types of financial instruments, the financial innovation of venture capital, where you can get funding to do stuff, but if it doesn't work out, your collateral is not all the assets that you currently have. It took several decades for that kind of financing tool to develop in the US. A lot of, not quite, we shouldn't call it false starts, no linear view of history, but still lots of experimentation. Some of it worked out, some of it didn't. As it started to mature in the 80s, then we started to have a lot of computer industry focused startups like Apple, and before that Intel. So that leads to the second piece, which is the types of technologies, right? The heavy industries with manufacturing precision at the forefront of value creation or moving elsewhere. And that's not just exogenous. These places are competing. When the Japanese semiconductor industry, electronic components industry started to decimate parts of Silicon Valley, lots of bankruptcies, people got thrown out of good, stable jobs, and then they were pushed into making their own companies or joining new companies, which coincided with a lot of spin-outs from universities where the technological paradigm was just right for that. So early years of the backing up another 10 years or so, Berkeley didn't have as many startups in the early years of the Cold War compared to Stanford, because semiconductors that Stanford was better at with their solid state physics makes better startups than nuclear for nuclear power plants and things like that Berkeley was better at. That's a picture of the 1960s. So we're talking before that, but then over to the 80s. So then if we look at the Japanese system in the 90s, following the successful 80s, I would posit that every single piece of what should be a modern startup ecosystem, the Japanese system was the opposite of what was conducive. Finance, Silicon Valley style model is venture capital, but Japan was main bank system. So it's hard to be an entrepreneur when you have to bet your whole family's fortune or non-fortune as collateral to be able to do something. Labor, we've talked about that. Highly liquid from all over the place and from big companies because they were disrupted versus, well, the 90s, they weren't going to lay off too many people. They were just going to slowly do attrition as much as possible. Small, medium zombie firms were protected politically. And so all the movement was slower. You couldn't pull an IBM and cut 40% of your labor force and shift towards services. University government industry ties, University of Tokyo or Tokyo Technical University. I mean, if faculty and researchers haven't spun out companies, it's hard to do that. And the staff doesn't know how to do that. And the industry side doesn't know how to utilize them well. So only by doing this over years, then they get a accumulation. And others like large companies, they wouldn't buy small companies, they were the suppliers. Versus here, Cisco and others have pioneered, rather than doing a lot of in-house R&D, old US style, they would just buy lots of companies to be able to do M&A style for R&D and norms surrounding entrepreneurship, right? Once you have a lot of entrepreneurs, it's easier to make more entrepreneurs because you just talk to a lot of people that have succeeded or haven't succeeded. And so there's a sort of a set of professional support ecosystem services that also grow up, law firms that know how to do this stuff, accounting firms that can take stock options if needed, which these are alien concepts if you haven't had that. So what I would say is all these pieces of a modern startup ecosystem are complementary to one another. They're interdependent, and each of them has positive feedback loops. The more venture capitalists there are more startups that can be funded. The more startups can be funded, you can have better returns, more funding for venture capitalists and more people. So all of these, if you look at their virtuous spirals plus interlocking nature of them, of course, it would take a long time for a place like Japan, which was at the opposite end of all of this, to be able to develop one. And they did it basically in parallel rather than replacing the core. Lifetime employment isn't going anywhere. Completely.
Yeah. So Robbie, you're one of the builders of these like systems. You have developed various models like that. So what's your take on this?
I think I would refer to a couple things. One is the work by Professor Alex Pentland at the MIT Media Lab. He has a wonderful book called Social Physics. And what he does is he thinks about how high performance groups are connected. And the result of his work is that you have to be a high functioning team. Has to talk a lot, everybody has to talk equally, and everybody has to bring in external information. Okay? Japan worked pretty well in the 60s and 70s, partly in the 80s on that, but things got a little worse because of the bringing in external information. One of my best memories of my students at TUS was a guy who said, well, my company, we're located in the Shimbashi area, a lot of bars, okay? And he says, it takes me 10 minutes to get from the station to the office in the morning, but at night it takes 3 hours to get from the office back to the station because you stop at so many bars along the way. Okay, if this is the case, Japanese companies should have a lot of communication, but it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is they're always talking to the same people. Okay? So I think what's happened in the last 5 years, 10 years, is that more Japanese have been going abroad again. Information is easier to get. And so the called the metabolism of information flow is getting better. So that's one thing I would look at. Another thing, this is recent for me, but I've just been reading recently a couple of anthropology books. Big hole in my education was anthropology. And there's a wonderful book called Anthrovision by Gillian Tett. She's a former FT correspondent in Japan. She's now, I think, provost of King's College in Cambridge. But at any rate, she wrote a wonderful book about anthropology and how sort of the balance between the tribal element of an organization and the rational element of an organization is very important for seeing how functional it is in society. I would assert that some of the, call it tribal elements of company organization. I'm a guy from Hitachi, I'm a guy from there. I think that became a barrier to getting information into firms so that they could sort of mix it up a little bit better. So those are the things I would point out.
So we have questions by our political science colleagues that are on this webinar about the role of the bureaucracy in the government in helping all of this. So Hiroki wonders what we think of the role about the bureaucracy. And so we know, or at least one version of how Silicon Valley came about is we need to get to the moon. Let's go to the moon. In order to get to the moon, we need semiconductors. Come on all to the Bay Area and build semiconductors. So the government actually was a big instigator of this whole activity. And so what do we think about this? And Christina, meanwhile, wonders whether the top entrepreneurs that Professor Kikkawa is talking about are as good at managing politics as they were at being CEOs. That is, that in order to be an entrepreneur in Japan, at least in the old days, did you actually have to play the political game? And is that different for Japan than in the United States? Could you be just an entrepreneur here without running the politics? And a final thing then, Craig wonders whether Japan's new commitment to defense spending might actually be one of these, well, what I just said, instigating, I guess, these starting moments for Japanese entrepreneurs to get going. Maybe Robbie, you want to think about that first?
Sure. Yeah. I think the first of those questions really comes in my mind back to the issue of how policy is made, who's giving opinions, who's at the table, who's talking about things, and what is the organization by which policy is integrated into a whole. And here's again a point where called network analysis, like Professor Pentland did, is very important. I did a little investigation a few years ago looking at how much overlap there was between various policy commissions in Japan, the Shinkikais, okay? And I chose 15 of the biggest, most important of these commissions. There were 294, I think it was, people on these various commissions, but only 14 of those served on 2 or more. And the point is that information wasn't flowing through the different, among the different bureaucracies, okay? Each one would choose its own commission members. They would say what they want to say on a very short notice or a very short period of time, but basically they weren't sharing information. For example, METI runs a thing called the Industrial, Industrial Structure Commission. It has 20 members. The Ministry of Education has something called the Science and Technology and Academia Commission. For years and years and years and years and years, there was no one on both committees. How are you going to run industrial policy if you don't have, science and technology as part of it. Now there's one guy. Okay, so that's good, but it's not a lot of progress. Okay, so my point here is that it was the vested interests inside the bureaucracies who were not forced to exchange information. As I mentioned before, the tying together role of the entrepreneur or the leader at the top simply was not done because the system was too heavily structured. In terms of defense and playing that role, I think it is. I have a little gizmo that I call the CRIC cycle: crisis, response, improvement, and complacency. I think Japan was in a complacency phase for a long time, but I mean, let's face it, East Asia is kind of a tough neighborhood these days, and I think Japanese are understanding that. And they understand, just as they did at the time of the Opium Wars, that if they're going to defend their country, they have to be a little more active about gaining technology, learning how to do things. So I think in that sense, the defense issues that we face now are going to be a trigger, not only for more entrepreneurship, but also for more information exchange with partners abroad who can help maintain stability and maintain peace in the region.
And I think we see this already, right? There are lots of, for instance, Todai-based startups in aerospace, which is a nice word for satellite technology and whatnot, defense technologies and so forth and so on. Kenji, on that point, a few quick thoughts or?
Yeah, I would say that we don't have time to discuss, because this is the sort of beginning of a different set of discussions, but the startup ecosystem in Japan, where it is now compared to even 15 years ago, is totally different, very exciting. If you look at the traditional parts of Japan and you come away thinking that not much has changed, that's just one part of it. If you hang out with the startup ecosystem people, entrepreneurs, and yeah, TJ's question, they're mostly men still, but it's a very, very different set of norms. They're independent VCs are funding companies that are growing rapidly, then they IPO, and then so you have 30-somethings that have what in Japanese terms is small fortunes that they can then use to invest elsewhere, start new companies. They sell off their companies in much smaller numbers than here, but that has happened. And so we have some serial entrepreneurs. And so if you look at a list of, and I've got this in the series, for example, some of the companies that have received the most venture capital funding in Japan over the, per year, but you look at what kind of companies there are. There's some interesting material, companies like Spiber, Preferred Networks is deep learning. And so things like this that give you a lot of hope and a very different picture of where we're going. So a lot of the post-war conditions,
If I can give the Japanese government a little bit of credit here, and not because they're sponsoring it, but because they deserve it. The founding of the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology 20 years ago was a major, major change. And there were some structural elements in that that were quite important. One was that by law, half of the staff has to be non-Japanese. So the idea is bring people in, get that interaction going. The other part is that it's not under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education, which turned out to be important because the curriculum control, all that was left to the local people in charge of the place to get done. Great model. And now, as the government establishes a new technology exchange center between MIT and Tokyo University and other universities, they're using that same model. So this will not be under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education. It will be it'll be elsewhere. So I think the idea that jurisdiction matters, that free movement of people matters, that bringing in external ideas matter. Those all things have become part of the system because the Okinawa Institute has been so immensely successful. My understanding is that they now rank among the top 10 universities in the world, adjusted for size, so they're very small, but they are a great institution. And that is a success of the Japanese government.
So we just, by way of answering this, actually answered Paul's question, which was about, is there actually much more innovation going on in Japan than meets the eye? Yes. And I think that's absolutely true, 100%. And it's not even that these companies are necessarily all victims to the Galapagos syndrome, where they only do this for the Japanese market. But a lot of them are in deep tech. Robbie doesn't like these labels, but deep tech, of course, takes much longer, whether that's biotech or engineering or sort of the runway there is often 10 years. So that's actually an interesting aspect of the now growing innovation ecosystem in Japan, is that a lot of this is not just apps that allow access to new cooking recipes, but rather new materials that feed into deep technologies. Trista is asking a question that's very dear to my heart, and I've actually thought about this for a long time, and that is Silicon Valley even the right model? And when we could go on forever on this, but really where I want to take us as we approach the end of our session here is, as we assess entrepreneurship in Japan, are we perhaps making the mistake that we compare it to Silicon Valley and say, well, it's not like Silicon Valley, therefore it's no good? Which I think is a mistake, right? The fact that it's not like Silicon Valley does not mean it's not good. And so there might be some differences in how we want to think about what actually is a good innovation ecosystem. And Trista talks about, well, aren't there some places in Europe that are much more similar to Japan, and just an outlier, perhaps Silicon Valley, and not so much Japan. So if you could, usually, I ask a question here now about what worries you most, but I think this Trista's question is much better actually to end this conversation, which is how do we want to assess entrepreneurship in Japan? I mean, how do we know a good entrepreneur when we see them, and what do you think is going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years or so in terms of entrepreneurship in Japan? Maybe Robbie, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. How do you know it when you see it? I go back to my definition before. Are the entrepreneurs good at tying people together? A good leader is somebody who is cheerful and tough. So if I see the personality of the person is able to bring folks together, but also make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that to me is a good sign of a leader. But also seeing opportunities and unfilled markets, seeing things that aren't there yet, that's another quality. So I would put those two things.
Great. I think a lot of this discussion, which since I'm in Silicon Valley, it's always relevant, is what do you think Silicon Valley is in your mind? And so lots of, it means different things to different people. It's a set of social values. It's a set of social challenges. It's a mentality. It's a concrete set of institutions. That's the way I see it, right? Funding, flexible people. And so it doesn't have to be try to copy and paste Silicon Valley elsewhere, but it solves a set of problems in a particular way. Where are you getting your funding? Who are your people? How are they connected? Just Robbie's point there. Are they connected or not? And it doesn't have to be fluid labor markets, but how else are they connected? And so government, university, industry ties, how do they work? They don't have to be like Stanford and Berkeley, but what else is out there? And so that's sort of a template of a set of variables we can look at, not to say let's be like that, but how does Silicon Valley model and other startup ecosystems solve these sets of questions? And then one framing that I think is useful is because Japan has such big, strong, large companies, bigger and stronger than elsewhere, of course it's going to be different. I think of it as a mental model of startups can do things that big companies can't. And if big companies collaborate with the startups, then they can sort of reorient themselves a little bit by injecting flexibility into their strategies. And I have numerous examples of this kind of thing. So not replacing big firms. Be fun to talk to Rick Katz about that for the future, but not replacing, it's not against, but it's a more collaborative, where they're not trying to disrupt the big ones. It's just to help move them change directions. And there are a lot of historical examples of the last 20 years where this kind of thing has happened.
Funny you should say that, because I was going to go there exactly. So everybody, we have 14 open questions that we've not answered. The feedback here from the audience has been terrific. Let me say that we're going to continue this. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk about this book, The Contest. And as Kenji just said, the first thing I'm going to tell our dear friend Rick Katz is that this title invites a longer discussion, shall we say. I agree with you, Kenji, that it shouldn't be a contest, right? It's in an ideal sense, sort of innovation is not a zero-sum game. It's not that the large companies lose when the small companies win. So to be continued. In 2 weeks from now, we're going to have Rick here, and he gets to speak about his book and his title. For today, I want to thank you both, Robert Feldman and Kenji Kushida. Thank you very much for being such wonderful guests. I could go on for another hour here, and I think so can the audience, which is still here in large numbers. So thank you, everybody. We stop on time at the Japan Zoominar, but please do come back in 2 weeks from now to continue this very interesting conversation. And until then, please stay safe. It's winter, and winter is not always good for our health. So take good care, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So stay away from the various bugs, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. So thank you very much.